Welcome back. Today I thought we would try to conclude something that has developed from a small series that I originally did towards the end of last year. It's all about the Thompson family who ran Primrose Mill in Clitheroe during the 19th century, and the reason that I originally looked into that whole family was because the site of Primrose Mill is probably no more than 5 minutes walk from the end of my road, so at the time I thought it would be an interesting project. If you saw those videos, you may know that I traced the children of mill owner James Thompson as far as I could, and I concluded at the time that none of them had any obvious descendants, and I thought that was probably why Primrose Mill didn't stay in the Thomson family. I thought that was the end of the story. I've since learnt that James Thompson occupied more than 80 acres of land in Clitheroe, including 7 acres, 3 rods on 2 poles, because we're in old land measurements here, of land called Great and Little Siddle Hay. The reason I mention those is because about 60 years ago my street was built on that site. Technically I live on land that once belonged to James Thompson. Earlier this year someone sent me an email, wasn't expecting it at all, but they explained that they were a descendant of Henry Thompson, James's 5th child, who he had with his wife Cecilia Starkey, the daughter of the Vicar of Blackburn. And it turned out that Henry Thompson had married Martha Read, and they had a daughter named Lucy Jane. And as I investigated this further, I found facts that definitely supported this story, and I believe that the person who got in touch with me has made the right connection. But the story is not quite as straightforward as it first seems. I've already looked into the Thompson family, so I don't really want to repeat myself too much, but I am going to return to a set of records that seem to have been relevant to Henry Thompson. He and Martha Read appear to have been baptised at the very same church, St Mary Magdalene's in Clitheroe. And from investigating Martha's baptism record, I learnt that she actually had a twin sister. This information was enough to help me to locate a parish register entry for the marriage of Martha and Sarah's parents, Robert and Martha Read. Because this is before 1837, there are no marriage certificates at this point in time in the sense that we know them today. What you have to look at instead is parish registers. You may notice there's an 8-year gap between the marriage of Robert and Martha and the baptism of Martha and Sarah. They're twins, apparently. When a family historian sees something like this, a great 8-year gap, the first question is, did Mum and Dad have any other children during that gap? The wedding is in Clitheroe, Martha and her twin sister are baptised in Clitheroe, so it is reasonable to guess that we need to look at the Clitheroe baptism registers from 1817 onwards. I was able to find records for 6 other children. Hannah, the eldest, was baptised less than 6 months after her parents got married. We know what that means, and I come across cases like these all the time It is simply a part of family history and family history research. It happens now, it happened then, it probably happened as far back as you can go in history. It is nothing remarkable, and after all, family history involves human beings, and human beings act on human nature, so it's understandable that these incidences come up now and again. I've been doing family history research for a long time now. I've been looking at my own family for more than 20 years, and I've been researching for other people for more or less 10 years now. And one thing still trips me up now and again, so I offer it to you now as a little tip that you can use in your own research. Many times I have searched for a child on the census because I've found their baptism record, or I've gone to look for their marriage record and had absolutely no success, only to go back to the original parish records for the place where they should have grown up and find in the burial registers there that they didn't actually make it past childhood. And sadly that was the case for 2 of Martha Read's 7 siblings. So we can actually use that information to begin Martha Read's family tree. Very fortunately, Robert and Martha Read didn't move away from Clitheroe. Even more fortunately, they survived well into the 1860s, so I was able to find them not only on the 1841 census, but as far forward as 1861. But it wasn't quite as straightforward as I was hoping. I couldn't find them initially in 1841, and there was a reason why. Robert had been mistranscribed, he'd been written down as Richard, and it was only by cross-checking the names of the children, because I hadn't been able to find Dad, so I thought we'll try the children, some of them are small enough to still be at home, they've got to be with their parents surely. And I realised also that one extra member of the household, an Eliza Jennings, had the same name as Robert's wife Martha's maiden name, so I'm guessing that Eliza is a relative of hers somehow. That was another clue that suggested to me that I had got the right family, and here's how they appear on the 1841 census. Perhaps you have noticed though, there's something curious about that census record. 2 children are missing. Hannah, one of the older ones, and more importantly of all, Martha, who is connected to the Thompson family. I'm going to cover Martha very shortly because she's important to the rest of the story, of course, but I thought maybe we should deal with her siblings first. Hannah, a weaver, had married John Hartley, a tackler, which is another textile-based occupation, in December 1837, again at St Mary Magdalene's in Clitheroe, and they went on to have 3 children, James, Maria and Robert Thomas. All were baptised at the same church. They lived at 14 Queen Street in Clitheroe, and by a really strange coincidence, they lived next door to Richard Edelston Kirkpatrick, who got a mention in my Finding Food video last September. So you never know where research is going to take you. But very sadly, Hannah did not have a long life. On the 15th of December 1850, she was buried at the same church where she'd been married. She was only 32 and her address was given as Lowmore. A few months later, the census shows her widower, John, still at Queen Street with the 3 children, so we can make a family tree for them. Then there's Catherine, a power loom weaver. She married Robert Dewhurst, a cotton warper from Billington. As you can see, the textile industry was pretty well established by this point in time in East Lancashire and elsewhere in Lancashire too. They had 2 daughters and they lived on Russell Street in Clitheroe. But there was more than met the eye to Catherine's story. When I looked into the details more closely, I discovered that their daughters Alice Ann, born in 1845, and Eliza, born 1847, had actually arrived prior to their parents' marriage in 1850. That's unusual. Why it happened that way, I cannot even guess, but again, it just shows that these things did happen. People did not necessarily get married first and then start a family. Sometimes they did it the other way round. Then there's Sarah, married an overlooker, John Martin, on the 7th of June 1846, again at St Mary Magdalene, so clearly this is a parish church that the Reads attended fairly regularly for family events. In 1851 we find that Sarah and John Martin were living at 13 Queen Street with their 2 children. David is 4 at the time and Henry is 1. 6 more children will arrive over the next 20 years, and subsequently the family moved further down the road to 27 Queen Street. Maybe they just needed a little bit more space. Jane was not the easiest of the siblings to find. In 1858 she got married in Liverpool, of all places, to someone with a name that you really don't want to have to search for. You do not want to find this name in your family tree. Her bridegroom was William Jones, a porter from Flintshire in North Wales. He'd actually been married before, so by 1861 William and Jane had settled in Liverpool. To be more precise, they're living at 42 Knowsley Street in Everton, and included in their household are his children Thomas and Edward. Thomas is a 22-year-old mariner, Edward is a 20-year-old cabinet maker, and there's also Jane, aged 11, who is a scholar. From her date of birth, I'm assuming that she was also from the first marriage. So from that, again, we can make a bit of a family tree. As for Robert and Martha Read, the parents of all these children, they just stayed in Clitheroe. In 1851 we find them at Bordlands, where Robert was a labourer at a print works. Bordlands is not too far from the edge of what is now the park at Clitheroe Castle. By 1861 they had moved to 17 Water Street. I'm not exactly sure where Water Street is. It's not a road name that is particularly familiar to me, But at that time, 67-year-old Robert was still employed, he's still working, and he is a cotton warehouseman, which is rather interesting considering his daughter's connection to the Thompson family, who had a textile factory. And indeed, that is probably a really good point to return to Martha. I haven't talked about what happened to her yet. So now it's Martha's turn. As someone who is quite crucial to this part of the Primrose Mill story, Martha Read herself was surprisingly difficult to locate on the census. It took me a long time to find her, particularly in 1841, which is not the easiest set of records to work with anyway. You get no information about anybody's birthplace, it's simply whether they were born in the county where they lived or whether they weren't. It's a simple yes or no question. It can be really difficult. And what made things harder in Martha's case is that her surname had been mistranscribed. It was only 7 months after I started researching the original Primrose Mill videos that I found her. She was then still a teenager, of course. Her name had been misinterpreted as Martha Hand, not Read. The word is roughly the same shape, to be fair, which is something I find it useful to bear in mind with mistranscribed words, is try to look for a surname that's coming up, or even a forename that's coming up, that is roughly the same shape in terms of how the letters are shaped. The census image itself is also very difficult to decipher, but I was able to work out that Martha was living a little more in Clitheroe. She's 15 years old. She is a servant in the house of none other than Charles Thompson, Henry's brother. Now we are starting to unpick the puzzle. If we move forward now 10 years, in 1851, Henry Thompson is living in Primrose in Clitheroe. That's the area, that's the location, that's his address. And he's saying that he is unmarried, which is technically correct. But where is Martha, and where is the child Lucy Jane that he allegedly had with Martha in 1846? They should have both been alive. They should have both been somewhere. The General Register Office birth indexes show that Lucy was registered in the district of Liverpool in the final quarter of 1846, which just means that the birth was registered between the 1st of October and the 31st of December. She could, of course, have been born anywhere up to 6 weeks before the time of registration, so possibly we're looking for a child born as early as mid-August. The next problem comes with the fact that Lucy Jane and Martha, and presumably Henry as well, didn't stay in Liverpool. On Boxing Day 1846, so with no particular urgency here, Lucy was baptised at the Collegiate Church in Manchester, or Manchester Cathedral if you prefer. It's also known as that, and I think also known as the Church of St Mary and St Denis. So there are various ways that that particular location is described. Lucy was born in 1846, so she should be around in time for the 1851 census. Sure enough, 4.5 years after she was born, I found Lucy with her mother Martha in Chorlton in Manchester. Also with them was Martha's unmarried sister, Jane Read. What is really interesting here is that when you look at the information on the birth registration and the baptism record and the census, it all leads you to think that Henry Thompson and Martha Read were married at this point in time. And yet, when we found Henry on the 1851 census for Clitheroe, he quite clearly claimed that he was a single man. The birth registration, baptism and census records all lead you to think that Henry Thompson and Martha Read were married before 1851, and yet that only applies to the census record for Martha. When we found Henry in 1851 living in Clitheroe, he quite clearly claimed to be a single man. There is a bit of a discrepancy going on here. Why does Martha claim to be married in 1851? Is she telling the truth, or is Henry telling the truth? Maybe Martha had a reason to say she was married. Maybe it's because she was living with her little daughter and she wanted to look respectable. Maybe the census enumerator asked for Lucy's details and then just assumed that, as her mother, Martha must have also been called Thompson at this time and therefore must also have been married. So who is actually telling the truth here? The answer is in the parish registers for St Hilary's Church in Wallasey, which is not too far from Liverpool. In keeping with this story, the marriage register is actually fairly vague about certain really quite important details. You could be forgiven for thinking that Henry's father, James, was a newspaper printer or a stationer. It doesn't specify anywhere on that marriage record that James was actually a calico printer, so a textile printer. Nor does Henry say whether or not his father James is alive or whether he is deceased. Well, he was already dead at the time when Henry got married, but Henry gives us no clue whatsoever about this on the marriage record, so that could take you on a false lead if you didn't know the story from the other side. So where do we go from here? I'm going to pick that up in my next video, because now that we've looked at Henry and Martha, I think it only seems right to pick up Lucy's story and to see where that goes and what that will tell us. So the next video is where Lucy's story will really begin.